Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's PMI Friday webinar, What Makes a Good Kaizen Project, with Damion Albinson. My name is Susanna Clark, and I am going to be facilitating the session today, which includes running the Q&A desk. So we'll be using that throughout the presentation. You can find the Q&A and the chat buttons on your Zoom control panel, so please do have a think of some questions, keep them coming, any comments, any observations, and I will be sharing them with Damion. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll send you a link via email early next week to the full recording, and that will have both the audio and also the presentation that Damion will be giving today. As usual, we're also broadcasting live on Facebook and LinkedIn, so to those of you who are joining us on those live streams, we welcome you. In future, to be able to participate in polls, receive the recording via email, and to make suggestions for any future topics, please do register for the webinars at pmi.co.uk/webinars. Finally, from me, before we get underway, we'll also be sending all registered participants a short Voice of the Customer survey. We'd be really grateful for your feedback and all your suggestions for future topics. And now I'd like to hand over to Damion. Thank you, Damion.
Thanks, Susanna. So welcome everyone to this week's Friday webinar, What Makes a Good Kaizen Project. So for those that haven't been on a webinar with me before, my name is Damion Albinson. I'm a senior consultant with PMI. I've been with the business now for 8 years, coming into 9 years. And I've worked in and around business improvement for the last 20 years. Crikey. Also in one of the roles that I used to have as a senior improvement manager, I was also responsible for the governance process around Kaizens, lots and lots of Kaizens that our business ran. And that gave me some very interesting insights when we start talking about scope and how much a Kaizen can tackle in reality. So we'll get into that today. So what I'd like to cover is, I just want to touch lightly on what is a Kaizen improvement. I'm sure many of you coming on this webinar may already know that or be familiar with it, but for those that aren't, I'd just like to cover off the basics. And then we're going to look at the characteristics of a good Kaizen. Who should we be thinking of involving in these Kaizen improvements? And then lastly, what are some of the mechanics and points for organizing a Kaizen event, as we call them. Okay, so let's start with the word itself, Kaizen. What does it actually mean? I don't think there's a direct Japanese translation. It is a Japanese word, but this slide suggests it's the Kai part means to change, and the Zen part means for the better, or change to make something better. It was introduced by someone called Mizaki Imai, and he brought it over, at least he brought it to the attention of the West in around sort of the mid-80s. And what he was trying to convey about Kaizens is this idea of what we now refer to as continuous improvement. And I want to come back to that point later on and explore that a little further. But that's what the word means, Kaizen. It's a Japanese word for continuous improvement. So for those that were on last week's webinar, you'd have heard my colleague talking about, how to choose the right improvement method, because there are lots of them and there's lots to choose from. And this slide highlights a few of them. So Kaizen, you can see there, is one of these improvement methods. It's a way, it's a technique out of many others. And so what I want to briefly touch on today is, so what makes Kaizen different from some of these other techniques without covering off what was touched on last week. So in terms of continuous improvement, well, in PMI, we have a model for this, and some of you may have seen this before. If we take this idea of this chart of performance in the vertical and time in the horizontal, all processes can suffer from this kind of natural decay. If they're not looked after and they're not cared for, then the performance can suffer as a consequence of kind of uncontrolled change, people adding things in, and generally a lack of standardization, which can have a detrimental effect. So in terms of process management, we help our clients to think about standardizing first, having an agreed way to operate a process as a starting point. For many clients, that can even in itself result in what feels like an improvement to performance just because they've now established a standard. Then the idea is that that standard is maintained for a period of time. And once we've maintained the standards, there's usually things happening during that period that can give us insights about how we might be able to make the process better. And that's where this gradual, incremental, small change happens. And the name we give to this is continuous improvement. So we have this cycle, standardize, maintain, improve, that you may well have seen before. And this is really where Kaizen sat. Kaizen is very much about this idea of small incremental improvements, even continuous improvement. And so we can explore that a little further. So unlike other approaches to business improvement, there might be a requirement to make much bigger change happen much faster. This could be for a whole host of reasons. It could be because of competition, it could be a change in customer requirements, it could be something else, changing legislation. And we do have other approaches for that, where your bigger belt type projects might sit, your Six Sigma, green belt, black belt projects, those kind of things. And they often result in not necessarily refinements to the existing process, but rather redesign of that process, big fundamental changes. And although they make change happen, big change, they take a long time to organize and set up. So that's just to illustrate the differences between when we're talking about this small continuous improvement versus the bigger project type stuff. So here's a quote from Imai, the guy that brought Kaizen into the West, and he said, "There can be no improvement where there are no standards." So the starting point in any improvement is to know where one stands at the moment. And it's a really important point, because one of the Kaizens is a very effective improvement method, but it's usually predicated on the idea that your process is already standardized to some extent. Now, I'm going to caveat that with something later on and come back and talk about, well, what if your process isn't standardized? Could you still use Kaizen? And the answer is maybe. Okay, so but really the essence here is that all improvement, not just Kaizen, relies on there to be a degree of standardization in the first place. The reason for that is, it's analogous to building a house on weak foundations. Okay, the likelihood is that something's going to move, there's no platform, and that's going to cause problems. Okay, so we need to be mindful of that message. So what is a Kaizen improvement? Or what makes it different from the others is, one of the main things about it is the speed. Kaizens are rapid approaches to business improvement. They consist of relatively small teams, and the idea behind them is that solutions to problems are implemented really quickly. Now, this, you might imagine, sounds very appealing, especially if you're maybe a senior manager or something in an organization, and you maybe not had great success with these giant, lengthy transformation projects that seem to take forever. And suddenly someone's saying we can do improvement rapidly. You think, wow, yes, that sounds more like it. Let's have a bit of that. There are a number of cautions, of course, and partly what I want to cover in this webinar. So I'd like to do a poll, and I'd like to know, in your experience, how long does implementation of process improvement typically take? Okay, so I've been quite general there with that question. So we've either got, it's something that we usually do within an hour, within a day, within a week. So I just move the poll out of the way. Within a week, within a month, within a typical quarter of a year, within the year itself, or perhaps you're not sure, you don't know. So we'll just give you a few moments to have a think and to vote on there. I can see the.
So yes, that poll's launched, and thank you everyone for putting in your votes. So at the moment, the leader for this is within a quarter. we have absolutely nothing at the moment within an hour or within a day. I think generally, that's not unusual, is it? A lot of people's perception is that improvement does take longer than that. And we've got a couple of people who are not quite so sure. So I'm just going to keep that open for another few moments, and then I will end it, and we'll let everyone see what the results are. Okay, thank you.
Settled down, yeah. So, wow. So that's actually really very interesting. And it's interesting for a point I'd like to come on to later on. That what's interesting about it is that nobody observes improvement being something that's done within an hour or even within a day, a business day. It's more common, clearly, for nearly 50% of the audience to expect improvements to happen within a quarter, which is understandable, isn't it? When we talk about greenbelt projects and those kind of things, we often say that the time frame for those is 3 to 6 months. So it seems reasonable that people experience that sort of speed of change and improvement.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Excellent, thanks, Susanna. Okay, so something that Imai was trying to convey with this Kaizen method was back to this idea of it being continuous, and what he even used the description to say daily, all the time, constant change for the better, improvement. And what's really interesting about Kaizen is that to some extent over those years, it's I wouldn't say it's become something different, but there are slightly different versions of it, which I am going to talk about in terms of how long the actual events take. But ultimately, what he was trying to get people into the mindset of is that this wasn't just something for the shop floor. This was for everybody in an organization. It didn't matter where you worked. You didn't have to be an assembly worker on a production line. You could be working the phones in a call center. You could work in a bank. It's universally applicable. But the notion was the same, that it's something we should be doing all the time, not just we've finished a project and that's it. We won't do anything for 7 weeks and then we'll think about doing another improvement. So it's quite different to that. And again, revisiting our process management cycle on this screen, the idea is that it's through the maintenance of a process that's been standardized that people gain these insights about, where the waste is, if they're educated in that, of course, where the variation might be coming from. They're developing theories all the time. They should be responding to problems and thinking about problem solving, which in itself is going to lead to us having a better standard, provided that, of course, we use some kind of root cause investigation techniques. So maintenance in itself gives us the insights to be able to make these small refinements to a process. The standardization part is so key because that locks these changes in to make sure that we don't slip back to where we were in the past. And so thinking that Kaizen is just about making lots of little changes and say to everybody, great, free reign, go and change whatever you like, by definition would mean that you don't have a standard. And that could actually do harm to the business and its performance rather than it being improvement. So this standardization component is very important. So what are the characteristics of a good Kaizen? That was one of the main areas of this webinar today. I think the first thing we should probably settle on is that they need to be successful. They need to achieve success, as I've said on this slide, especially if it's one of the first Kaizens that you've run maybe in your organization or in your team or your department. And the reason for that is that Kaizens involve small teams working together, and it would be unhelpful if their first experience of this maybe new approach was one that didn't achieve anything, because they do require a degree of investment, particularly of people's time and energy, and they're very kind of intense workshops. You really are committed for a number of days to really focus in on a narrow problem. And implement some change. So if all of that energy has been consumed and yet we didn't achieve anything, that's going to leave people feeling very demotivated to maybe want to do it again. So planning for success as always, but especially on the first events, is really important. And therefore, there are some things we need to carefully consider to give ourselves a greater probability that that event is going to be successful, which I'm going to talk about on this slide. So the three constraints in my experience that can affect a Kaizen event. The first one is resources. And what I mean usually by that is people, the people in the business that you may need to work on this event with you. The duration of the event is something quite fascinating, which I want to talk about later on, and the scope. How big of a problem can we take on with these things? And in my view, as one of these things increases, usually the others have to increase with it. So if you want to tackle a larger scope, you're probably going to need a bigger team, more representative of maybe an end-to-end process. That might mean that the event itself needs to be a larger duration. Consequently, if it's a smaller scope, the duration can be reduced, and maybe so can the resources. And one of the biggest challenges I think I see my clients face is where they've adopted this idea of doing Kaizen improvement because it's very appealing, rapid change instead of big, long, slow, laborious change. But what they want to do is take on really big scope problems, but then are very coy in terms of how much resource or duration they want to give the event. And that can lead to Kaizen failure. And by failure, I mean that the Kaizen doesn't deliver a tangible, measurable business outcome in terms of a change, a positive change. So that's one of the challenges that many organizations face. Now, what I would say about that is that maybe in the early days of doing Kaizen, learn from those first few Kaizens. If it turns out that your scope did turn out to be too big, despite having tried to narrow it, then that's a lesson, isn't it? That's a lesson we can learn from, so long as we don't repeat that and do the same thing again and again. And it looks like we have a question coming in from people. So
yes, we do. Thanks, Damion. So a question from Chris, and they say, can you give some examples of how Kaizen can impact an organization, maybe a training company, rather than somewhere where things are made? So I guess a non-manufacturing service type example would be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the starting point really for a Kaizen should be, what's the issue we face? What's the problems we recognize? So if you work in a training organization, perhaps it could be something about, errors in material that we give out to trainees. Or maybe perhaps it's feedback that we've had about, the content that we actually deliver, it's too complex, or it's too simple, or it wasn't relevant for a particular audience, so they could be problems that you could say, okay, what's our process for generating those outcomes that's dissatisfying the customer? And then you're into Kaizen, but you've got to try and slice the problem down to something appropriate for a Kaizen event. So I think an example I literally heard about this morning from one of our clients was someone that had been laden with a Kaizen that was to reduce the abandon rate in a call center, because the abandon rate was running quite high. Now that's an enormous scope, because clearly that abandon rate could relate to different types of calls. It might be worse with one type of call than another. So problems like that are too big, but the idea is that if you break them down into smaller pieces, you tackle them bit by bit. In fact, that's a point I'm going to come on to later on. So I think hopefully that answered your question.
Indeed. And thank you, Chris, for your question. And please do keep your questions coming. And also, we do a bit of training ourselves. So if you do want to get in touch and talk about some of the opportunities we've had to run Kaizens for improvement, please do get in touch. Thanks.
So successful Kaizen events should have these characteristics: strong stakeholder commitment. So that's particularly the local management team, maybe even some of the senior leadership team, being really vested in recognizing this problem that we're trying to tackle. Even though we've maybe gone after a very narrow point of it, it's part of a much bigger problem. So if we do lots of subsequent Kaizens, the sum of those is going to add up to a big change. There's also something about handing over a level of control and autonomy to a team of people to make decisions. So you really want leadership and management to be bought in. And I'll talk actually later on about ways of actually making that even more, I can't think of the word, even more kind of relevant for the team that you've formed. Manageable and well-defined scope. We've just been talking about scope, and I'm going to even come on to a little bit more on that shortly. Organised and a prepared team. So Kaizens, albeit they might be relatively short events, there is almost like a hidden runway of preparation that's required to get us to that point. So the more organised, the better in a Kaizen event. Readily available supporting information, which could be in the form of data or access to information, and access to knowledge holders, which might be in your organisation, technical experts or specialists in certain areas. That you may want them to come and be part of the event, even if they don't have to stay for the whole duration of the event. You may bring them in at certain points. For instance, when you're maybe forming some ideas about solutions, you might get them there to tell you that certain things maybe just aren't technically possible, despite the ambition. So again, planning ahead and thinking about, well, who might those people be based on the topic that we're running a Kaizen on. So the duration, this is something that I find quite interesting, and particularly with the results of that poll we ran earlier about people's experience of change. So in my experience, I'll talk about that for a moment. The lengthiest Kaizen event we were allowed to run was 5 days. Now, many people are quite surprised at 5 days. They think that's really lengthy. Most of the Kaizens we ran were 3 days. But it's known that Kaizens can be as short as maybe only a few hours. And if you look in different organizations, so if you take the likes of someone like Toyota, and I know I want to sort of avoid manufacturing, but if you take the likes of them who are often held up as being the sort of the grandfathers of lean and some of these techniques, when people talk about those people doing Kaizen events, they're literally very small changes that the operators and workers are doing all the time, every day. And yet in the West, we often talk about Kaizen as being these events that last days, so somewhere in that spectrum is, and actually they're all the same because they're all forms of continuous improvement. So my theory, at least on Kaizen, is that the more often you run a Kaizen on a process, I suspect the duration of the event can become smaller and smaller and smaller. And one of the reasons for that is that when you run an initial event, which you may plan to run for 5 days, you can do a number of things in that event beyond just tackling the problem. You may give some of that agenda over to training people. So we used our Kaizens in a company I worked for as a way of educating everybody in, what is improvement all about. So many companies often run like white belt programs where they give people like a 1-day course of the absolute basics. What is lean? What is waste? What is variation? So you might run your initial Kaizens to be longer and include an element of training in there. There's also activities within Kaizens where you're mapping out processes, you're understanding what the customer of those processes want, you're identifying wastes, you're obviously coming up with solutions. If that work has been done once and you run a second Kaizen maybe a few weeks later, a lot of the analysis perhaps is done. It's already there. And so therefore the team can get straight into how do we refine it again and again and make it better and better without necessarily having to go back over all of the legwork of the analysis. So that, I think that it maybe goes some way to explain why some organizations are talking about Kaizen as being almost things within the hour. Other organizations are talking about these events that need to be planned. And my theory is that it's to do with the maturity of the organization and the process and how standardized it is. If the process isn't standardized, you may use a 5-day event to really try and get in just to establish a baseline condition from which then you can speed up improvements. So I don't think there is a definitive how long should a Kaizen be. My only word of caution would be people that are attempting to go after big scopes with very immature processes or knowledge in the organization about improvement, and hoping that they can just do it in half a day because that's about the only time they can commit. And what they're doing there is they're forcing, they're essentially planning for failure. So I think learn from your initial Kaizens, make them longer, if anything, rather than too short, and then get a grasp for what sort of scope and things can you achieve in that time, and can you shorten them based on experience and knowledge and practice rather than shorten them because of availability. Back to the point we talked about, where there can be no improvement where there are no standards, which might implicate why initial Kaizens perhaps need to be longer. Okay, so another constraint that might affect the duration of a Kaizen is the speed of the process itself. What I mean by that is how many things does it transact or units does it process, in a single day. One of the vital parts of Kaizen is using this cycle, PDSA, which I'm sure any of you that have been on our webinars in the last sort of 9 months would have seen this numerous times now. It's one of the core principles of PMI. It's talking about experimentation, trial, testing, forming theories, testing them and learning from that. And what Kaizen and continuous improvement are all about is exactly that, getting teams together to not just talk about ideas, but actually test them, see if they work, and use the tests as a way to figure out, what ideas are good versus those that maybe aren't so useful. So if your process is very slow, let's say it's an accountant's process that only transacts something at month end, you don't have many transactions to study in order to learn. Whereas if your process produces 10,000 widgets a day, you can do that experimentation much faster. So that can be another constraint that might determine, the length of these Kaizen events that you plan to run. So I want to move on to scope that we introduced in the triangle of constraints. And to get a feel for this, I've got another poll that I'd like to run. This one's quite topical. We're in the 2021 finally, so goodbye 2020. And what I'd like to know is, for any of you that have maybe made New Year's resolutions on the new year, how many of you, or how have you failed any of those resolutions already? Where are we? The 15th of January. So I'm looking for some honesty here. So yes is answer 1. Answer 2 is no, but you think it's likely, maybe based on previous year's experience. No, of course, means that you're doing very well. You're being very disciplined and behaved. And number 4 is you didn't make any resolutions. I know many people don't. So let's see what.
And while those results are coming in, Damion, which one would you be voting for?
I would be number 4 actually. I don't make New Year's resolutions.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. I see that cop out, isn't it? Boring. And this is okay. Wow. This is okay. Very interesting.
Okay, those last few moments. If you haven't yet cast your vote, please do. Okay, I'm going to end the polling now and share the results with everybody.
All right, fascinating. So we have 51% that say they don't make resolutions. So fair enough. I think that's quite common. 18% of people have been honest enough to say yes, they've already failed their New Year's resolution, whatever that was. And a further 10%, oh sorry, the 18%, I'm sorry. And another 10% that says not yet, but it's likely, right? So 28% looks like it's going to be going, down the pan. 22% holding in there with no, so very diligent. And maybe it's just not early enough yet to say. So really interesting. Now, I couldn't find a reliable source of statistics and data to validate any of this, but I did do a bit of Googling around in terms of my research. So taking heed of my colleagues' webinar before Christmas, how to lie with statistics. Not that I'm trying to lie here. So what Google suggested is that 25 to 50% of people, only 25 to 50% of people make resolutions. Well, that holds true with our results, doesn't it? We got 52% of people saying they didn't make any. And out of those that do, 50 to 92%, very precise, fail within the first few months. So, okay, we certainly weren't at those levels, but we were certainly heading towards them, weren't we, with this sample? So, so why is that? You know, why does that happen? And it's probably something to do with change itself, and almost like our impatience of wanting to make it happen. So there's an analogy, I guess. If my problem was I have this enormous pile of rubble that I want to locate from where it is now to some other location, I could go for the big transformational type change, right? I'm going to get it all moved in one day. I'm going to hire a load of heavy plant equipment like diggers and JCBs. And the only downside of that is there's going to be a lot of organization with that. I've got to get permits. It's going to cost me a lot of money. I need to make sure that my insurance is covered for that working on site, and all the rest of it. So although it's going to be rapid when it happens, it's going to take a lot of organization to get to that point. Kaizen, on the other hand, continuous improvement, would be analogous to saying, well, why don't we just get a team of people together and start thinking about moving one rock at a time? Maybe if we stood in a line, you know, so we can pass one rock to each other. And although it takes longer to get rid of the mound and move it, we've actually broken the task down to something that we can get our hands around it, excuse the pun. We can manage it, control it, and it's doable. And not only that, but we get a sense of achievement every time we move one of those rocks, rather than waiting for the huge mound to be depleted by diggers and so on and start to worry that maybe it won't happen on time. So they're kind of like the polar opposites of these two types of improvement. And give you a sense of, you know, what Kaizen's really trying to do is break these big problems down into really tiny pieces and chip away at it constantly. And the more people develop that technique and that ability, you can start to come away from perhaps the more lengthy 3 to 5 day events and start coming down to something much more regular, even down to daily perhaps, with enough practice and the right coaching. And so back to the thing about New Year's resolutions, you know, people might give themselves these really kind of ambitious goals, and actually having a goal is fine. It gives us something to aim for, you know, it's making sure that the subsequent events we might run are aiming after the same thing. It's this impatience of wanting it now. You know, I want to be in a band at the end of this month and perform. I was going to say down the local pub, but that's obviously not happening. I want to be in this band, but yeah, I can't play an instrument and I can't sing. Right, okay, so how realistic is it that I'm going to get there in terms of self-development? But if I maybe made my plans a little bit more realistic and broke that challenge down to smaller things, the way that music lessons might be broken down into various segments, I might be more likely to get to that ambitious goal. So that's the same analogy. So one of the tools we use in Kaizen events is this matrix, which is often, I think it's called a Boston matrix. So it has these two axes, ease and impact. So low, high on both. And this matrix is often used to organize and filter solutions that people have come up with in the event. And what we're looking for in a Kaizen is solutions that the team believe have a high impact on the problem, so some measurable high impact, and easy. They're easy to do, and by easy we mean fast. And when I'm talking fast, I'm talking stuff that we can go away and do in a matter of hours. So back to that poll we ran at the start where no one said they've experienced change that fast. That's what we're looking for in a Kaizen event. And the reason I think it's useful to recognize that is it gives us maybe some insights about, well, what's likely to be possible from a Kaizen event, given that the changes themselves need to be something we can do in a matter of hours or maximum maybe one day. It levels people's expectations a little bit about not wandering into them with these enormous, ambitions of, solving massive problems. What we can also get followed by those improvements are those that are fast and easy, but maybe don't have such a big impact. So we could prioritize those differently. For solutions that have high impact but are not so easy to do, they often end up in some kind of post-event plan. So you can still carry some improvements over into the days and weeks that follow a Kaizen event. But I highly recommend that any Kaizen event is attempting to actually make the change happen in the event itself, to not run Kaizen events that only generate a list of ideas, because those events those ideas rather, they tend to never see the light of day, because the team that's been formed for the duration of a Kaizen event is gone at the end of the event. They've all gone back to the day jobs. And it's the Kaizen leader that's then left with this list of solutions that they've got to try and now implement by themselves on top of their day job. So you can imagine the challenges there. So again, good organized Kaizens, keeping the duration, long enough, particularly in the first events you run, means that the team get a real sense of achievement, that they've not just come up with some ideas, but they've tested them and implemented some of them in the event itself. So even by the end of maybe a 3-day event, a team can reflect on, we have made these changes, and we can perhaps we can even measure it, but certainly theorize what the measurable benefit of those changes would be. Down in the bottom corner here, low impact, not easy changes to do, abandon them, not interested. Doesn't mean they're bad ideas, just means they're not Kaizen. Right? They're not continuous improvement things. They might be changes that perhaps some of the bigger change methodologies might take away and look at, like the likes of Sigma Belt projects. Okay, and then resources. So we've talked about duration, scope, and now finally resources. Who should be involved in Kaizen events? So we've talked about keeping the team relatively small. You don't want to get these enormous teams in Kaizen events, because generally the more people on any project, the more interactions have to take place, and that can just generally slow down decision making. So you want a relatively small team, and top-down led is best. And what we mean by that is, if somebody who's leading the Kaizen event also has a degree of authority over that particular process that's being worked on, then they can authorize change in the event itself. Right? And something that can stifle Kaizens is where people aren't sure if they have permission to change things, and therefore they're almost frozen with fear that they've got these ideas, but are we allowed to actually go and even test them, let alone implement them? Now, I appreciate that not everybody who's senior and has authority might have the time to come and run Kaizen events. So if that's the case, we can deal with that slightly differently by getting the senior people to come and usually open the event up. So maybe give a 5-10 minute speech about the problem and why it's really important to the business that this problem is tackled, at least some of it tackled, appreciating the scope. And we would often recommend that those leaders come to the closing event of a Kaizen as well. Now, something we used to do in aerospace when I was the improvement manager, we would always invite, or I would always invite, the whole of the senior team to any Kaizen event that was finishing. They always finished on a Friday. And we'd often get 3 to 5 senior managers, sometimes even the head of business would come, and they would listen to the team present back not just what they'd achieved, but how they achieved it, the steps they went through, the methodical approach they'd taken to get to some of these changes, which we teach in our teachings of how to do Kaizen. And the reason that was important is it gave the team members, bearing in mind that these are often operators, it gave them the sense that their improvement ideas and the things they want to change have now got the backing of the business. They're not going to be washed away next week because someone's, found something more interesting. And for those changes that maybe have to take place after the event, there's now a sense that there's buy-in to those, that they will get seen through and managed to the point of implementation. So it really gives the team this sense of power and empowerment that they are in control to some extent of change. And that leaves them leaving the event with a really high degree of satisfaction, that if you ask them to get involved in a second or third or fourth event, they're straight in there. They're volunteering for it because it's been a good experience to them, something different beyond the day job. Other considerations in terms of who needs to be involved. Well, we say, and I've made the point already now, the people at the work level, okay? The people who operate the process day in, day out, they are essential to any Kaizen event that you run. So a majority of your team should be made up of those people. You may even include people at the managerial level, so supervisors, managers. They can often bring different perspectives when you're looking at problems or knowledge about how things work or don't work. You may even include customers of that process and or suppliers, which may even be external to your organization. That takes a little bit more organization to set that up, but certainly internal customers and suppliers. It can be really helpful to get those on board, because one of the components of this is process improvement, where you're developing this sense of that there is a chain of events, or chain of steps rather. And so people that are maybe isolated to only part of that process in their day job suddenly get the perspective that actually everybody else in their parts are also struggling with various problems and constraints. And there's a sense of then togetherness, that actually it's the entire process that needs to improve. It's not just their section that's got all the problems. So including customers and suppliers can be useful for that. I think we mentioned on a previous slide, technical or subject matter experts. You may bring those in, again, to support. Because there aren't often many of these in an organization, it makes sense sometimes to only bring them in at the points in a Kaizen where they can add value. So if you were going to use the first half a day of a Kaizen event for, say, some basic level lean training or something, you wouldn't want these poor people to have to sit through that 70, 80 times a year if that's how many Kaizens you plan to run. You would let them come in maybe on day 2 or something. And a facilitator. Somebody needs to lead the events and facilitate the discussions. In the Kaizens that I ran and also supported, time was very, very punchy. Even on a 3-day Kaizen event, time is exceptionally tight. There's an awful lot of stuff to get through. And you need somebody that's organizing the group to make sure that all of that time is used for maximum effect. And so having someone there to organize that, I think, is essential. So lastly, how to organize the event itself. Well, we have a method, we have a cycle that describes how to run Kaizens, in PMI at least, a number of steps around the edge. But what I want you to focus on for today, at least, is the greyish cycle in the middle there. So we have a pre-event steps, we have steps to do during the event itself, and then we have things that might happen afterwards. I'm not going to go into lots of detail on this in today's webinar because of time, but there are those 3 phases. And the reason I mention that is because, and I picked this analogy up the other week off one of my colleagues. I think it's really fantastic for describing what a Kaizen event is. If you think about the analogy of arranging a kids party might last, what, 2 or 3 hours, something like that, relatively short, otherwise they all get tired. Although it only lasted a handful of hours, somebody had to organize a lot of stuff to make that a success. So for instance, there's the cake, there's the presents and the gifts, the entertainment, the food, the music that people might want to dance to, and probably a whole host of other considerations. And all of that seamlessly comes together in this very short pocket of time where everyone has a great time. So I think that's a great analogy for Kaizen. A Kaizen event that may only run for a short amount of time probably had 3 or 4 weeks worth of prep going into it, and that's the general recommended time frame. for that pre-event phase. And what's happening in that phase often is a lot of data gathering by the Kaizen leader, data that can be then presented to the team on day one of the event, rather than using the event itself to go out and start trying to harvest data, which itself could consume many, many hours of effort. So it comes back to the idea of the preparation, get the preparation good so that the team can hit the ground running. Then they've got more likelihood of delivering some improvement in the event itself. So I thought that was a nice analogy for a Kaizen. It looks like we have another question.
Not so much a question, Dan. I just wanted to let you know we've got some great feedback in the chat and the Q&A. That's really chimed with people. You've obviously got some parents on board who've done those kids' parties. So yes, that's really resonated. Excellent. Thank you very much. One question that has come in just as I was talking is, how do you measure success of a Kaizen?
Okay, good question. It's a difficult one to answer. I think that part of the prep, and I know that one of my colleagues is doing a webinar in a few weeks about tools associated to Kaizen, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but something we recommend in terms of the preparation is to formulate a Kaizen charter. So in that charter, you would be being asked to think about exactly that question: how do we know a change is an improvement? Okay, so part of that involves saying, and let me just, oh no, it's not on the next slide. It is in there somewhere. What's the performance before we started? Which is often what relates to the problem statement you've got, right? We've got too many defects. The process is taking too long. We've got too many complaints from customers. Something measurable is the measure is telling us we have an issue, right? Rather than it just being a subjective opinion. If you have that baseline, then what you can do in the Kaizen is, maybe not necessarily at the end of a Kaizen, but you would always plan that some point in the future, often within a number of weeks after the event, that you and this person who sponsored the Kaizen would agree on a date to go and validate that the claims you believe, the amount of change you believe that you've achieved, you go and validate that it actually happened. And that's one of the steps that I used to really be very keen on when I was responsible for Kaizen events, because all too often the Kaizen event has come up with a bunch of changes. They've implemented most of them. They've done some extrapolation to say, well, we believe the effect of this is going to be a saving of something to some measure, but they don't quite know yet until the process has had time to be affected. So if you don't ever go back and validate what did we actually achieve, then it's very difficult to know what the true effect of the event was. So it's a really crucial step, but it's a great consideration. Whoever asked that question, you should, with any change, you should always have some baseline measure versus some data in the future, even if that's not measurable. So for instance, you might do a Kaizen on workspace organization, and I did a webinar a few months ago talking about this one, 5S. Where you're not going to collect quantitative data like numbers, but you might just take photos. You might take some pictures of before and after. So you can even do that sort of evidence, but you need some evidence to show what have we actually achieved. I think it's a really key thing to consider. So it's a good point.
Thanks, Damion, and thanks for the questions.
So support and infrastructure, if we're talking about how to organise the events, and I'm going to lean more towards the virtual environment on this slide, because we used to talk about the physical environment, of course, when we were doing these events in conference rooms and so on. But nowadays we're in virtual environment. So some things to think about: eliminate interruptions, which is still as valid in the virtual environment as it is in the physical one. You want people, if they've signed up for the event and they've agreed to be on the team, then they're yours. Okay, that is your resource and you need them. So we don't want people, disappearing off to a meeting for half an hour or an hour, or being chatting away on a phone or something. We need them to be 100% committed to the cause. So we want to eliminate any interruptions of the day job that might try and pull them away. So things like keeping their phones off, turning off email clients or chat applications, making sure that their time has been secured in their diary. So sending out meeting invites in advance. And then think about the virtual tools that you might want to use with that team. So video conferencing, there's lots of applications like Teams or Zoom. Do people have web cameras? Because facilitating teams virtually, something that really helps with that is to be able to see each other on video. It gives the leader a great insights in terms of people's buy-in and commitments and body language, and how are they generally feeling without necessarily saying anything. And then I think I've covered off the management support already down there about invited to open and close the event. I think is always a good idea for senior managers, but also for those team members who have come to the event, or at least committed to come to it, have their managers confirmed that that is okay? Have they made the necessary arrangements to cover off that person so that they don't get put between a rock and a hard place, that their colleagues aren't asking questions of them whilst they're committed to your Kaizen event? So again, it comes down to organisation, planning, getting everyone bought in to make sure that we're committed to this Kaizen because we recognise the problem, and therefore we're willing to invest the time to get it sorted. Another interesting thing about Kaizen is this idea of going to Gamba. So for those that aren't familiar with that word, Gamba, Japanese word, it means real place, where the work actually happens. Now, some people might say, well, we're stuffed. We can't go to where the work happens because we're all having to work remote. One of the interesting things I found in the recent 9 months is that going to Gamba, for those who work in a non-manufacturing environment, I think that this is actually a bonus, a benefit. I don't mean it's a bonus that we've got a pandemic, but working remotely, because to go to Gamba is really screen sharing. So if you have a team of people together and you want them to show how the process actually works, so we can start to all look for opportunities and wastes and so on, people can share their screens and we get a front seat view of what they would normally be doing sat in an office somewhere. So that's actually a benefit of virtual working for those people. For those that are in manufacturing and some of the team are maybe actually physically still in a factory or something somewhere, you can still achieve this sense of going to Gamba by making use of modern day technology. Only last week, I conducted something called process confirmation from the comfort of this office. And the factory that I was looking at was 100 miles north of where I live. And it was nothing more than a guy at that client who literally took his phone out with him with a camera running and was able to show me what he was seeing, and we could have a conversation about it. So it is possible. You've just got to think a little bit outside the box and get creative, rather than let this situation we're all in dictate that we can't do business improvement. I'm not a believer of that at all. So here's the point that someone's question covered a moment ago. So I think I've covered this off already. Have that baseline performance, and in the future, after the event, usually between 4 to 6 weeks after the event, pin a date into when you're going to go and confirm what did we actually achieve versus what we thought we achieved, and what do we learn from that? What insights does that give us? Maybe the scope was too big. Maybe we didn't have the right team. Those lessons, if we take those into the next events, they're going to make us better and more effective at using the Kaizen methodology. So we should always think about learning from anything, both what went well and what could have been better from any Kaizen event. Those lessons are golden. And we also recommend something called the pre-event. So this is usually something that you would run maybe a week out from the event itself. So you've been doing all this preparation. And this is we've got it here as like a checklist. Have we got these attributes for our event? Now you can tailor these to your own business and your own needs, but these are our kind of stock conditions. And the point I've put at the bottom of that slide says it's better, in my opinion, to postpone an event that isn't prepared properly than to run an unsuccessful event. And that comes back to, again, the people's experience of the event. We want them to walk away from this feeling positive and energized and a sense of achievement. And a poorly organized event is not going to give them that. It's also going to maybe make the business think that Kaizen methodology doesn't work in their organization, which I've heard a few times. It's not that the methodology doesn't work. It's more likely the way that the thing's been set up and run. So, you know, if and what I say to the people I work with, if some of these components are absent, then either cancel the event or postpone it. Okay, don't go into it with things missing that could be the unfolding of the event when you get in there. So I think that's a key point. So just to summarize then, in terms of what we've talked about today, Kaizen is about continuous improvement, as we talked about in the beginning. The scope, the duration of the event, and the resources are all linked together, so one affects the other. Having a goal or a target is okay, but expecting to reach it in a single swoop of change is not okay. Okay, so think about breaking it down, but keeping your sights pinned on whatever the goal is. Senior management need to be involved and demonstrate their commitment through action, even if that's only to come and open or close the event. Even better if they can sit in there and be part of it. And the ambition over time should be to do more but smaller events rather than only a handful of larger ones. And yeah, I think that brings us to the end of what I wanted to talk to you about today. So are there any more questions, Susanna, that we
No,
tackle
I
before?
think we've answered all of the questions. For some of you, I've answered them either in the chat or in the Q&A. So thank you, everybody. Just to say, if you are looking for, you may be familiar with our online yellow belt if you are an existing or a previous PMI customer. We've actually launching a new version of our online yellow belt at the beginning of February. So if you are looking to start to think about Kaizens, it's a perfect solution to try and support and those people who will be involved in the Kaizens, help them understand a bit more about the role they play and to introduce them to improvement. So watch out for that. We'll be publicizing more information as we get nearer, but hoping to launch, or planning to launch, I should say, around the 1st of February. And also just to mention, we are still continuing to offer our iPad to anybody who joins our green belt, our black belt, or our master black belt program through our public schedule. So the aim of that is to give everybody who joins an additional device so that they've got plenty of technology to support them through their virtual classroom training. So please do get in touch and take advantage of that. So I think I'd like to say thank you to everybody who has joined us today. Do watch out for our Voice of the Customer survey. You'll receive that shortly, and we're really, really grateful if you can complete that. Give us your feedback on today's session, and as always, please make suggestions for future topics. We're always interested to know what you're interested in, and we do plan our schedules around that feedback. So on behalf of PMI, on behalf of Damion and myself, I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody, and I wish you all a very safe and a very relaxing weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.